1 second, folks. We are waiting for people to join. Hey, folks. We are still waiting on Yasira to join, and we may have another guest today. And in the meantime, you're listening to EDM by Stream Beats on Spotify. Fantastic, stream-safe audio by the one and only Harris Heller. Okay, let's close this. Okay, so I'm gonna, hopefully Yasira will join us here shortly, but in the meantime, we can talk about a few things. Number one, we kind of want to go over today the state of state management in React. So I ran a poll on Facebook that will share the kind of surprising results about basically asking people what they used for state management on their own projects, like outside of work, you know, like what would you use on your pet projects at home, whatever else. Because I was kind of curious if like that would just mirror what people did at work, or what really, you know. I know we will certainly use different state management, at least I will, for work projects and like personal projects. I can get away with just writing my own or writing like very lightweight things for personal projects where I would use something much more mainstream for work. And then I think we also may want to touch on, if we have time at least, Cloudflare routing. So this is on worker routes, and I've done a lot of work for Slick.af in terms of Cloudflare workers. All my APIs are served out of Cloudflare workers. It's lightning fast. It's been a huge pleasure, but there are some caveats, including things like internal routing. Like typically you would attach a worker to a domain. But if you have like a more elaborate REST interface, let's say collection/ID, for instance, that starts to become a little more complicated. So what we do typically is we attach a wildcard route to a worker and then actually build in little routing, like an express server, more or less, inside a worker. So I can show some tools on that. Sierra is still not here. Okay, so actually, I'm just gonna start on that, in fact. So, oh wait, here she is. Oh no, this is Matthew. Hey Matthew.
Hey Kevin.
We are still waiting on Yasira. So I'm actually gonna jump into the Cloudflare routing and showcase kind of like just a really lightweight, and this is kind of like why it's exciting to do Cloudflare APIs. Because deployments are stupid fast, etc. Okay, so anyway, let me share my screen. I'm just gonna share that for now instead of the Zoom.
Yep.
Cool. So this is not what we're looking at. We're looking at Cloudflare. So Cloudflare workers, if you're not familiar with it, Cloudflare workers. These.
I couldn't see your screen, Kevin.
Oh, you can't see the screen. Well, hold on. Yeah, I can't actually get away currently. Matthew, you're gonna have to bear with me. Or actually, if you want to load it up and then mute it, YouTube, I'll share the link with you in Slack.
Oh, okay.
You know what? Actually, not on YouTube. Do you have Twitch or no?
I have an account. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna send the.
You want to log into it?
Yeah, sorry. Twitch. First, Kevin on Twitch. There we go. I'll send you the link.
Are you live streaming right now?
We are. This is all being live streamed. In fact, they're all seeing logins and everything as well.
Gotcha.
I'm just kidding. It is being live streamed. But... Okay. So let me know. I would say mute it when you pop up that link. Yep. You can see it. Cool. Yeah, watch it through that and then mute it. Hey, Yasira.
Hey, I'm really sorry. I get caught in a phone call.
No problem.
As always.
Okay, well, I'm just going to do a real quick demo on Cloudflare workers. Just really fast to kind of showcase like what we can talk about in more detail later on in a more dedicated session. But I just kind of wanted to touch on this real fast to kind of show what's possible. Okay, so we're just gonna do a live coding demo. Okay, and Yasira, you're not gonna see anything on your screen. Let me send you that link too.
Are we live now?
Man. We are live, yeah. Live as of 12 o'clock. Come on. Let's see.
200 people watching right now. Only 200.
Yeah, exactly. 200 people
Whoa.
watching. That's absolutely not the case. Oh my god, I can't copy and paste between.
If you're watching, hi.
Why can't I cut and paste this to you? There we go. Okay, there's the link. Yasira, I can't actually get Zoom or OBS to record Zoom sharing my screen. So for the meantime, just log into this or watch this and then turn off the audio so you don't have that distraction. Okay. All right, I'll share my desktop again. Okay, so anyway, Cloudflare workers are the equivalent of like AWS Lambda functions or like GCP Cloud Functions and Azure Functions, etc. Except they're a little different. So those run containers, more or less like a lightweight OS, like an operating system, and system level code in a container. So it's like an image of Ubuntu running Node, for instance. Cloudflare workers are basically just running a tiny bit of code in the edge. And Mehdi, I think, gave a much better basically description of kind of how this worked yesterday. So we'll not use this right now. So anyway, you go to Cloudflare workers, sign up. It's free. And then it's like $5 a month for the not free version. Like stupid cheap for what you can build with it. And I'm just going to jump right into mine. So when I go here, I've got several different setups. I've got my own. I've got super generic, slick. So we're going to be doing this under slick because it's already set up for it. I'm just going to jump in and create some dirty code in one of my projects called slick, the slick engine. So here under DNS, this is kind of your first step. If you have a domain somewhere and now you want to put on like a subdomain or whatever else as a test endpoint. You want to have like a test.yourdomain.com to start throwing up a sandbox API. So I'd go here to DNS in the worker or in the zone basically. And it's literally as simple as creating a foo, a made up address, because it's going to be proxied, it doesn't matter. So I just find one that hasn't been taken yet, 9. All right, so 192.0.29, that looks safe, cool. I hit save. This is ready to go now. And I'm going to load up, this is going to seem kind of daunting because it's a learner project with lots of packages in it. But all we're concerned about in this particular scenario is this test folder, okay? That's it. So it's got the zone and account ID and all this sort of stuff set up. You would see this from any Cloudflare worker tutorial. And I'll also share a cleaned repo with this later on and throw it in the comments. But what we're interested in here is this. So foo. That needs to match up to that DNS we just set up. So foo. Okay. I'm going to actually increase my font size so people can see. And that's it, right? So we have this thing. It's going to be called slick test whenever I launch it. Doesn't really matter. I could call it slick foo or just foo in general. In fact, I'll call it foo. Right? So when we deploy it, it should deploy to foo.slick.af/wildcard. So it should catch everything within there and go there. Now, this is a standard like NPM project. Beyond that, right? So we have packages. We've got a couple dependencies. These are local, so it's really not important. What we would install is, let's see, go to packages, test. This is where we're operating out of. So this is kind of like the root of your project. We're going to see like standard stuff, node modules, package.json, worker, etc. Again, I'll share a lightweight repo on this. But the first thing, and really the only thing that we would really want is yarn add 80 router. 80 router is going to be the internal router that handles routing. It just kind of says, hey, look, a function on this API endpoint goes to this function. A function on this API endpoint goes to this one.
Hey,
that's
Kevin.
It. Yeah, what's up?
The bash window is cut off, so I cannot see what you are writing.
Oh, you know what? You're right. It's okay. So I ran yarn add 80 router. That's it. I'll have to move those windows around, but I don't have time for that right now. So we basically just added the dependency 80 router. So you can see my screen here. We're going to go into the index.js. I'll explain what these are in a second, but what we can just do is import router from 80 router. Okay. And then this is standard boilerplate. You're going to see this basically in every example Cloudflare worker demo, tutorial, code bit, whatever. You're going to see something like this, event.respond with, and you're going to put some handler. It's typically like, they'll define it like this, handler event.request. That's totally fine. In our particular case, we're going to make a router. Okay, so that's it. And we now have a router. And we're going to respond with router, oops. The router is going to handle the event request. It's the only thing it takes really is just a request. And it should do something. So right now it won't do anything because we don't have a route listed. So let's just start one, just a really quick one that's going to say, could not find that resource. All right, so could not find that resource and status 404. All right, so we want everything to just respond with the 404 to start with. In fact, we'll put it on all just in case. All right, so I'm going to deploy it and see if this works. You're not going to see this, but I'm running yarn deploy, which is basically just Wrangler deploy. Wrangler is Cloudflare's sort of little helper tool that allows you to push up to Cloudflare. Okay, it says it was done. So just like that, we should be able to test it. foo.slick.af could not find that resource. So in literally a couple seconds, we're live on the web. Now let's make some stuff. So I'm just going to create some to-dos. So const to-dos, and we'll create some, I don't know, one text first to-do, right? And we're just going to mirror this a couple times. All right, so this is just to kind of emulate an API. So we would get this from a KV store or some sort of like, Firebase or something like that. But in the meantime, we just want to add some routes to kind of explain like what you can do with this router. So we're going to have a get to-dos, right? And we'll say, we'll just put the handler right here, in fact. So we're not going to take any parameters on this one. And we're going to respond with this as JSON. I'm going to show you what this is, but it really just creates a new request or a new response with the right header to make it text JSON, and then it stringifies whatever I pass in. So as JSON to-dos, that's it. So that's what we're going to start with. It's going to get anything that says /to-dos, and it's going to go to as JSON to-dos. Let's look at that real fast so you can see what it does. Utils, probably just here. So as JSON, right? It takes some content and some options just in case you want to pass some extra options. It stringifies the body, adds in the header. This is just a tiny piece of boilerplate that you would use everywhere, so you make it a single function and include it. Okay, with that in mind, it's really just creating a response, but in JSON form. Let's publish it, yarn deploy. Again, you're not going to see it. All right, it's done. So we should be able to see this. Oh wait, to-dos, there we go. All right, it's there. So again, just like that. If you were doing this on AWS or GCP or Heroku or whatever else, we'd still be building and trying to deploy. Like this would take a while. So that's one of the advantages of Cloudflare. It's kind of the Wild West. There's not a lot of tooling built around it, but it's freaking fast to deploy. Okay. So now let's get into route params. So this is where the magic starts to happen on AD router. So we can say like get to-dos /d. And this is going to be a request coming in. And let's say this. Const to-do is equal to to-dos, where we get request.params.id. This will come from the string right there. And we'll say if to-do return, actually, we'll do a ternary. So if to-do, then we're going to return that to-do. So as JSON to-do, otherwise missing handler request. That would work. That way we don't even have to. Oh wait, where's our missing handler? Yeah, so missing handler probably is just this, a function that returns a new response. So we're just going to use this, missing handler. And it takes a request, which is why we're able to use it here without a signature. And so we're going to kind of match that here. So we're going to actually return missing handler with request inside it, just in case you don't find it. Or in fact, we don't even have to do that. One of the fun things about AD router is the if it doesn't return, it'll treat itself as middleware, and it will just keep going through the flow. And since we have this all catched middleware, we can literally just say if to do return as JSON. Remove this entirely. This will actually work. So, and you could, of course, condense this down to a lighter signature or whatever. But so right now we have the index, and we have a single item that is looking for the item. And if it's found, it returns it as JSON. And if not, it says, okay, I don't know what to do. And then the next thing catches it and says, I do know what to do. Everything is going to go to the missing handler. So yarn deploy, and we're going to test this. Ooh, actually, we already see a problem here. We're looking at the index here, but ultimately what we need to do is find. So the ID, let's get this. We're just going to call this params. Pull this out. So it's actually todos.find, where t.id is equal to params.id. And this is going to come across as a string because JavaScript doesn't know. It's just going to come out of that. We're going to cast this as a number. So number params.id. So string 1 should turn into the number 1, which is what we have. And we're trying to find the to-do that matches. Let's deploy this again. Other catch with Cloudflare workers is when I hit deploy, it's great. It went out. But the question is, when I hit refresh, I may be on an edge that doesn't quite have that yet. Sometimes it takes a few seconds. So we're going to find out. 2. We got it. All right, so to-dos 1, to-dos 2, 3, etc. And that's really all there is to it. So that's like the short and quick version. We can also do things like patch, put, post, delete, basically any method you can imagine. IDRouter actually supports all of them. Like just, I could do puppy. This is in the example, but puppy, something. And as long as the method, basically, you have a request that looks like this, method puppy, URL, I don't know, google.com/whatever. That thing will match because the puppy will match to whatever you've defined here. So it's literally any method you can imagine. We'll work on this. It's very extensible, etc. Later on in a more comprehensive demo, I'll show things like an extended router that I've wrapped around IDRouter that basically says anything that fails with a proper failure will be wrapped in a try catch. So I don't have to write a bunch of try catches in my handlers or anywhere else or in my middleware. It's just automatically can get caught and you can tell it what to do, which is a super handy paradigm just to keep your boilerplate very lightweight. Yasira, Matthew, what am I missing on this? Anything else to cover before I kill this?
I think you haven't shown us like, what if like the ID doesn't exist? How does the response look like?
Right. So first of all, excellent point, Yasira, thank you. So let's just look for missing. We don't even have that route, so this is what we should expect. So no route found for this. This is what the missing handler does under the hood. It just spits back out the URL basically, which is fine. So now we've got to-dos. We've tested with 2. Let's do it with 4. No route found for. And you could obviously put in a much more detailed message that says, hey, like that's not it. Like, you know, if to do.
Yeah, of course you can.
Right.
You
so let's put in
do your own like custom messaging.
Right.
If there's no to-dos, right? Or you catch it all.
Wait, that's just never mind. So that's yeah, we're just gonna build one. So new response. That to do was not found. And we're gonna make sure it has a 404. So status 404. Yep. So we deploy this again, and we should see a better error in a couple seconds. Let's use one we haven't found, so it's not cached. I'm returning, right? Return new response. Yep. So there we go. So we can also see that I was refreshing there for a while, about 20 seconds. And it deploys lightning fast. But again, sometimes the edges you're hitting with your request won't have that latest code. Same thing applies to Cloudflare KV, their key value store. Same sort of thing. Like that data will write to it instantly, but the next request that comes in may not see it yet. So you have some challenges with that. The trade-off being it's just so fast and infinitely scalable. Like I can hit this endpoint 100,000 times in a second, and I'm pretty sure it will just work. I don't have to scale any nodes or anything like that manually.
How does middleware work with the router?
Okay, great question. You're really feeding me all this stuff, Yasira. So first of all, I'm gonna here, back to my desktop. I'm gonna share the router. So it's 80 router on npm, and this has all the demos. This has the docs, etc. that you're gonna need. Obviously, we have something that was kind of like what we just built. Get to dos with an ID. This shows a post, for instance, if you want to like create a to do with a wildcard sort of thing. We've changed it in our particular example just to kind of keep it nice and clean because I'm not adding all these comments. But middleware, a great question. Middleware is any function, and you can put in a series of functions to any route, and basically any function that does not return something. It does not have a return statement that gets fired will act as middleware. So it can modify things, or it can just sort of do nothing. This is an example of it takes a request, just like any handler, and it embeds something on the request. So it says, hey, I'm going to embed a user with this hard-coded thing here, but that could come from a store or whatever else. It can also be asynchronous. So, maybe you have to look up a user in a database and then say, if the user exists, I embed it, and if not, I go ahead and maybe throw an error or return prematurely, like with a non-authenticated thing. So this example shows using these in chain. So for instance, this route has with user, which embeds the user, then require user that says, if you don't have a user, you exit out with a 401. And then finally show user, which just says, I'm going to output the user that hopefully exists at this point. And this is an example of a failing one where we'll require the user, which would then go on to show user, but it doesn't have the user injected yet. So this one would say, hey, doesn't exist, 401, kick it out. So we'll do a little bit. We'll just add one right here that says, you know what? I'm gonna steal one from Itty, or from my stuff. Crap. Where's utils? There we go. Okay. So middleware with params is a great example. So we're gonna just write one here, or I'm gonna cut and paste it really. So with params takes a request, and ultimately it is exploding out the params and the query that Itty router injects. So typically, you see how we have to go into params here. We can't just do ID. So in a lot of my functions, I get kind of lazy and I want to type a bunch of params or request.params. I literally just want that injected directly into the request so that I can just access it normally. So what we would do is with params, that's it. And this will say, if this thing exists, it will be injected into the request, and therefore I can access it as a first-class citizen. So let's deploy it and see if that works. Okay, and again, it's going to take a few seconds. Ooh, so here's an example. We broke something, and we're not sure what. Export conf params. So here's also where I would switch over to the throwable router, and I can show that again. Now I need to go into detail on that in a different, more or less episode of this, because I don't want to pay the entire time with this. Let's see. But let's try this again. Still nothing. Okay, let's redeploy. The export shouldn't have mattered, but all right, I'm gonna cheat. So we're gonna use the robo router instead, and this will give us some insight because instead of this horrible Cloudflare error, we should actually see some sort of JSON error. There we go. Oh, that's interesting. We are failing to connect. But to-dos should work. So my guess is we just kind of screwed that one up. Nope. Super weird. Oh yeah, this is because we're accessing params that doesn't exist. It should have told us that, to be honest. So I'm not quite sure what's going on here. Horrible demo. Apologize, but this is the nature of live coding. So things never work out. Thanks, Yasira, for throwing this wrench at us. Goodness, like what did I do?
Ooh.
I'm gonna back up because something's not happy here. Anyway, we can go back to the docs, but this is basically how it works. You can chain these together. You can throw them upstream, like, you know, on a get wildcard or an all wildcard or whatever else. You put stuff on post. This is how you would add cores support to the thing as well.
What other stuff are you using for the middleware for your Slick stuff?
I use a ton, to be honest. Yeah. Let me go into mine real quick. So middleware, these are random. They're not super organized at this point because I haven't, you know, number one, it's my own project and I haven't really just broken it all down yet. With body is a very common one that I use that basically says like it's going to look for the content type header. This happens if you submit a form or you basically post some JSON or whatever. It's going to have content type and it's going to look for it and say, if I have it, then I'm going to go in here and basically try to do the different parsing mechanisms, right? So if you say you have application JSON, I'm going to try to parse it, the body as JSON. I'm going to embed it, in this particular case, on the request as an attribute called content. So anything downstream of this with body, if it has a body, will have a content object. And it won't have to worry about doing like JSON parsing or text parsing or whatever inside the body of your handler.
That's similar to the body parser, right? The middleware.
Exactly like body parser on Express.
Could you use like could you use that body parser in the middleware?
I don't know.
Is that or not?
I don't know.
Okay.
It would all depend on whether the signature matches or not. So remember, Express stuff. If they're only working on the request, then sure. If they're modifying the response, then no. Because in IDI router, you don't build a response. You could build it, but you'd be embedding it and passing it along in the request, and then submitting it later. You could write an extended thing that actually builds a response and passes it along, but by default, that's not how it operates.
Yeah, I see.
So with cookies, that's another one. To where I enable cookies. Cores, super common one, where you're building the cores headers and stuff like that to make sure that that's okay. Let's see. Authorize, like these are also super common. Like you're gonna check and see if it has a token. The reason I wrap these in try catches is I wanted a custom error that was dictated by the middleware and not just caught by that final missing handler or whatever else, or broken handler. So I wanted a 401 rather than a 500 basically coming out of that. But yeah, I have tons of little middlewares, and I just chain them together. So like for instance, if we look at, let's look at the public API. So for instance, right, so here's a with user. And what with user does is it looks for, ultimately in the params, it looks for a user ID. It says, if I have a user ID, I'm going to go and try to instantiate a user class and embed it. That's all it does. It basically just says, there is now a user object on the request that's ready to go. You can do something with it. So in this particular case, I await get details and I post it back as JSON. That's all. Let's see, I don't really use them as much. So I do the with user a whole bunch just to sort of add like controls. Let's see, like admin certainly uses them more extensively. With user, you know, is admin because only I can do this one, for instance. Still using like the missing handler sort of syntax. With authenticated user, which is different, it gets it from the JWT token you have to send in, rather than just some sort of user ID, etc. Like, I use them literally all the time. And then this is how you handle subrouters, which again, the docs just go into it, I think, in a better detail. But if I want to have this wildcard that says admin / alias or my, for instance, or my, say my aliases, I can just pass it off to another router. And so this is literally just another IDI router. I pass it off to the handle function of it. And you know, a handle function just takes a request as well, just like any other handler. So you can use a router as the handler for a route. So in this case, we just let all wildcard go into it, and then it handles its own subroutes. And the cool thing is those subrouters don't have to catch 404s, because ultimately, as long as you have a 404 on the outermost parent at the very end, it'll catch anything that does not connect. And we'll just treat that router itself more or less as middleware. Any other question before we close it down and talk about state?
One more question in terms of like logins. So when there's a log error, right? You hit the route, it spits up the error. I know like a GCP function, Azure functions. If you go to their dashboard, it will log all the errors that function has. Does the Cloudflare functions has all these logins?
Honestly, don't know. It probably does, but I couldn't answer that.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll find that out, but I would assume yes. That's just my blanket assumption. So like actually, for instance, if we go to workers, let's look at the one we just launched. So foo.
And also has some sort of searching functionality that you want to search for specific errors.
Yeah, so we see 8 errors. But those may have just been the 500s and not the like 404s and whatnot that we were returning earlier. So I don't know offhand. Have to dig into that.
Yeah. Cool.
Yes, sir. Anything? Or should we talk about state?
Let's talk about state.
Awesome. Okay. Killing this. No more IDI router. We'll talk more about that another time. Okay, so a little bit of background on this. I'm going to share this. Hopefully everyone can see it. Let's zoom this in. This is a post that I put on the React.js expert community, which is actually a very active group on Facebook that I recommend everyone join. But I posted the question, what state management do you use for your own personal new projects? The reason I asked this is I was very curious if people would use just what they use at work, or if they would, like, I would hope from this sort of survey that I would see more stuff on kind of like the bleeding edge of React State. Because for your own personal projects, you would use something that was like a little bit less tried and true, right? Instead, what I found is that overwhelmingly everyone uses Redux. Like not even close. So 273 votes on Redux. The next closest was hooks, which some people had some confusion of. They're like, hooks aren't state. And I was like, well, you use hooks like use state, use ref, use effect to sort of operate state flow for your app. And luckily, I think enough people got it because there were 103 votes in that camp. Context was also added, which I would say kind of goes hand in hand with hooks, but it's like sort of an extension of it. Like you can use hooks as state management without any sort of context, but context will improve that flow by lifting some of that stuff upstream to allow multiple downstream elements to sort of subscribe to it via hook. And then we have go ahead.
Yeah, with context, you can do like global state management. With hooks, it's just like prop drilling, right? Like it's so local to your component, and you can pass it down as props. But with
Correct.
context, you can lift that up. Yep.
Exactly right. Yeah. So I highly recommend if you're going to use hooks for state management, use context, use providers at the high level. It does make your life easier. It's a little bit of boilerplate, but not a whole bunch. And then you can just expose nice clean hooks downstream to the components that need to access this stuff. Okay, so anyway, those three are huge, right? Redux is basically the next, basically everything else combined and then some. That was very surprising to me because, you heard it from Dan Abramov himself, Yasira, that, Redux, while really cool at the time and still really powerful, is probably, didn't he say that he probably wouldn't recommend it these days? Yeah, I mean,
he was talking in a learning setting, right? Like with student, and he said he won't invest that much time for a student to learn React. Redux, just to know state management and use it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would say on those lines, if you were going to learn React today, number one, I certainly would skip Redux entirely, but I don't think it's the place you start anyway. I wouldn't say MobX either. I would say these days it's hook based. You could. Yeah.
Hooks and
that is it, right? Because you're going to use stateless functional components, and you're going to use hooks. So use state, you're going to master use state. Now in the beginning, you'll use prop drilling. You'll put your use state in a parent component, and you'll prop drill on down, and that's fine. Later on, you'll move that upstream to context or whatever else. But
yeah, I think it's in a learning setting, it is really important to understand your prop drilling and managing your local state first before you go into abstracting it away and put it on parent and just have the children subscribe to those state and have it a global state, right? Instead of just having it all global and you access it everywhere you want to, and you don't get the feeling of how the data flows in the application in React.
Yeah, it's kind of like the conversation we were having earlier about more or less data hooks, where you have convenient hooks built around API fetching, because that's one of the most common flows, which is, although I think Zoom is frozen on my thing. Okay, there we are. Where you're fetching an API result, like to-dos, for instance, and you want to have a loading state, and you want to have a done state, and an error state, and all that sort of stuff. And there are a lot of options out there. But in the beginning, I would say, write your own tiny little hook that says, first of all, I'm just going to fetch some to-dos. And when I'm done, I'm going to set my state using the setter part of that hook. And that's good enough. Your app will absolutely reflect from that. Now, at some point, you're going to say, oh, I want a loading indicator. And that's when you're going to add a loading flag, Boolean, that says true, false. And so you can have either two use states, one for the isLoading flag and one for the data, or you can start to use the use reducer, or just, you don't even need to use that. You can just use the reducing syntax of use state, of a state setter. And I'll just share my desktop on that. And let me pull up where it was. I'm just going to pull that. Actually, this is just a random thing. So I'm going to, don't even worry about what's in here. But when I talk about the reducer state, so when you have use state, so it'd be const, zoom this in. All right. So you have like const, just call it state, or maybe value, right? And set value is equal to use state. Now let's give it a default value of 13. We're gonna do another one that's like loading, set loading, default value false, right? And ultimately what you would end up doing is you'd set loading true, then you'd fire some asynchronous thing, and then, you know, async function. I'm just gonna put some sort of pseudocode here, and then when you're done with it, it'd be like, then, you know, with my new value, I'm gonna set value to value, which is also the equivalent of just set value. So you'd set value, right? You can do that, but then you also, wait, the problem is you want to do two steps, right? So you want to set value and you want to set loading false, right? So this is a very common step. What you've done here is you now triggered two renders, which is not cool, for when that can really be handled by one, and they almost always change together. Like the data is going to change with a loading state. So what you could do instead is this. So const state, set state, you can call this anything, but you're going to make this an object instead. So let's just call it value 13, loading false, right? And so you'd either do set state, where it's state goes to an exploded version of state, state loading true. That is the equivalent of what we were just looking at. And then down here, it would be value and loading false. That's it. And so now you've combined two statements into one, and you would just pull those values out of the state. So if you ever need just access to them, you would say like, you know, const value and loading is equal to state. Now you just have access to them anywhere. So that's basically the reducer method of when you have a whole bunch of things that kind of change at once, you would group them together into an object, probably in your provider in your context.
Isn't a set state is done in a batch though? Like it's not done like one at a time to.
What do you mean?
I'm not really sure now. So if you do like a set state something on your code, and then below it do another set state. So on one pass that will be batched together, no?
I don't know.
Create one, like it will only invoke first one render instead of two.
I would say that it has a chance. I'm not honestly sure about the internals on it. I should know that, but I would say that it has a chance to in that pattern, right? In the set state pattern, because you're accessing one hook, period. It's one hook, and you're firing the setter against that one hook. So it would have the chance to batch that, where it absolutely wouldn't have the chance to batch a whole bunch of little micro ones. And I've tested it in terms of like showing a console log in your function, right? This is what happens every time it gets rendered, whether it gets reconciled or not. You're going to see that sort of rendering this component. And when you have a whole bunch of little micro setters, it's firing a whole bunch of times. It's not grouping that at all. So, but with a single one, it might. I'd have to run some tests on that and see. But either way, it's more efficient, hands down. And it might be even more efficient if it does what you're suggesting, Yasira.
So, like, if you're nesting it like that, right? Why not just use reducer?
I just don't see the point. Like the syntax is so easy to do yourself, and then the reducer, if I recall correctly, because I looked at it briefly and I was like, this is like for people that are just so embedded with Redux that they can't get away from the patterns of Redux, that they have to have that same sort of syntax, the same sort of dispatcher logic. And I'm like, in my opinion, like this is a much cleaner version. So why stick to the old patterns that you needed for the old system? Embrace the new. And so you can create your own equivalent of dispatchers without having to like dispatch everything in that same sort of like
and remember the type.
Right. Like I think that's holding on to legacy concepts that they should live and die with Redux, because they really make sense with Redux and not with a lot of others. So, okay, let's go back to the list though. So, obviously the other one is MobX, not very popular. I would expect MobX to have been much higher on this, to be honest. It's a big library, and it handles some really cool stuff. So people who aren't familiar with MobX,
I'm using it.
Yeah, I helped you. I'm sure it's not mobx.com. What am I doing? npm, let's say MobX.
Oh, it's your decision that make us talk with it.
I know, yeah. And man, obviously hindsight's 2020. But see, okay, so this is not like an unknown package. It has over 500,000 downloads a week. It's really powerful. Like, I loved that you could just sort of make object models and then have them observable with your app. Now, what I don't like is you have to still wrap all the little connectors, much like you would with Redux. And that was kind of a pain, but it's really powerful. I would say MobX is wonderful for when you're doing like deep state management of things like large living documents, where the documents have like business logic built into them, etc. So you just want to fire like on your to-do, your item to-do, maybe you want to fire some method and then have your app update. Well, currently using the context method of state, what ends up happening is kind of like what we do in Marathon, our project, and Slick and everything else. You have your nice ES6 classes, like your collections, your collection items, whatever else, and they're completely unaware of React and state in general, right? So it's just like you're writing code in your console and firing it. But they have methods on them, right? They may want to do something like, they may want to fetch their own data or send an update command via fetch or whatever else. So what you end up having to do is expose some sort of mechanisms, like when that thing happens, then fire this other method that I'll hand you later from state that says basically a set state that allows your app to refresh. It's kind of a pain in the butt. So the reason I bring that up is Recoil, which is, again, very few votes, six people. And this is what I was asking you about, Yasira. Like, Recoil was announced, well, I don't know, but a year or two ago, with the concept of state, like use state, but not component bound, which is actually really exciting because it means you can have the equivalent of the state hooks or whatever just living in JavaScript space. It's unaware of React, and then React can then watch it, I guess, and react to it in the same sort of way. And that's really powerful because it means you can now mix your state items. You can have number one dynamic number of them, and that's huge because that's very difficult with existing hooks. You can have a dynamic number of like state elements, like to-dos, for instance. I can't just create, if I come back with 13 to-dos this time and 12 to-dos next time, like I'm not going to create 12 different hooks for each to-do. I'll just end up storing the whole collection of them in a single hook that is like the list of to-dos. Recoil allows you to do individual components, which promises to be way more efficient, right? Because if one to-do changes, I don't need to refresh that entire list. Only one, like any time that one to-do is updated in my app, that's the only component branch that should update, not the whole list.
Is that what they call atom
yeah, so yeah,
update?
Recoil has atoms, and they're just like tiny little autonomous hooks that can live outside of React. I am really excited about actually trying to use them. I just haven't had an excuse to do so. And on Slick, where every byte matters, Recoil is like 10K, and I just haven't done it. But that would absolutely be one of like my top picks these days, is to start to explore Recoil, because I think hooks are fantastic, but they have the limitation of it's bound to a component, and you can't handle dynamic elements like easily, right? You just simply can't. Maybe someone can like educate me, and if so, please, someone list in the comments like what you do for hooks with a dynamic number of elements, where each individual hook contains one element, not one hook containing everything. But
Yep.
And yeah, and then there are obviously some my own custom solution. We all do that, that's for sure. MobX state tree, I mean, that's kind of like an extension of MobX, I would say. Hooks, crooks, and one-eyed jacks. Not sure, but okay.
I love the one like saying, what is state?
Right.
What was it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I put that one in myself. I didn't vote for it, obviously, but yeah, some people they just don't know what state is, and there are also the joyous few people that just don't even have to know what state is. For whatever reason, their apps are so simple, they don't need state.
Yeah. So Kevin, you mentioned earlier about size, like recoil just a
Yep.
couple
About
kilobyte,
10K.
I think.
Yep.
Yeah, about 10K. So what does why does that matter? Like, as
Sure.
long as it can do like it can do the state management for me, what's
Absolutely.
the difference, right?
So it all depends on what you're chasing. In the case of, I gotta watch the time a little bit. We've got about 4 minutes. In the case of like Slick, for instance, I am doing, it's sort of like a challenge, like a code golf game of like, how tiny can I keep this package? Like the entire code base for the gallery viewing, etc., for the public is 50K, which if you know how big packages are, React itself with React DOM is typically around 45K. So I'm using Preact, which is much lighter. And basically everything is home rolled internally. Like there are very few packages I've brought in that's just like code I didn't want to do that was light enough for me to get away with it. But in a case like that, I'll just write my own state because all these state management libraries are very feature rich and detailed. But why would I add 10K to 50 unless it really gives me something that I don't have? And it may, right? So when I explore recoil, I may be like, this is so like mind-blowingly game-changing, it's worth the 10K. But the problem is when people don't look at these package sizes, they start to just pile on 50K here, 50K there, 30K there, and suddenly they have an app that, when production minified, is still over a meg, and like they wonder why their app is kind of slow and gets slow Lighthouse scores. Well, it's because you're basically downloading like, a giant chunk of data right at the beginning of you even trying to use the app. So I use Bundlephobia. So let's look at that. So Bundlephobia, right? So recoil, again, it's 14K. Man, I was wrong. So 14K for recoil. There may be a different version that that has a, maybe an updated version that's slightly smaller. One that I absolutely always use these days is styled components. And at the latest versions, like this thing is tiny for what it allows you to do. It's basically an entire design system at your fingertips. Let's see, MobX. I'm pretty sure MobX is a big one. Oh.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, wait. So, but there's MobX, but then there's the MobX React, right? Because you have to use that to hook it in. So you're talking roughly 20-something K. That's still not terrible. Redux is tiny, if I recall. But it's, what is it, Redux? React Redux? Or...
Ooh.
There we go, 5K. Yeah, but I mean, Redux, it's very magical for how tiny it is. The trade-off is your code's going to be huge. So you'll save it all in the bundle, but then your code is going to be like 10 times longer than everyone else's. So it will probably, bite itself back. What else was there? And then the hooks, that's one of the advantages of hooks. It's built in. So there is no 2.6K plus 5K plus whatever. It's just part of React, so it's there. But anyway, yeah, watch the bundle sizes, people. And if you're doing like a big app for an internal tool at work, who cares, right? If it's loads fast enough for your employer and everyone's happy with it, that's great. But for your personal projects or anything you want to be mobile friendly on the web, I would say look at Bundlephobia, watch the overall size, minify it at the end, and say, like, do a network graph when you reload your page and say, how big is that download? And try to keep it small, really, because your site will just speed up from shrinking that.
Awesome.
Okay, let me look at my calendar real quick. I think I got a jet. Actually, I'm okay to stay on for a few more minutes if you guys want to or not.
Yeah, Kevin, I think next time if you can show us something like how to inspect all these optimization related stuff.
Sure. I mean, I can do it right now because it looks like I don't have a meeting at 1. I'll do it real fast.
Okay.
So
The lighthouse, doing the lighthouse.
sure, Lighthouse. So let's just use Slick as examples, right? So this is the homepage is Slick, but I do use dynamic imports, but only for admin sections. So like unless you're logged in, you're getting it. Also the home, these pages, like these about pages. I don't need the content because most people will never click on that. Really, what you would end up doing if you got to Slick, it's because you got a link to someone's gallery like this. So this logic plus that homepage is all baked in to a single two JS files. So what you do is you let's go back. I'm gonna get off this index page. We go back to here. This has no images, so we won't get that cluttering up our inspection. So you'd right click and inspect. All right. I'm gonna zoom this in a little bit too, just to kind of see. Network. We're gonna hit refresh. All right. I'm gonna zoom this in a little bit. And what we're looking at, okay, get off my screen. We're gonna do a hard refresh, in fact. Okay. So this is a brand new user's just come to it. It's 2K basically of the index file itself. This is the HTML. If we do a view source, it's this, right? There's a little bit of more or less like service worker injection kind of baked into it. Then you have basically the app.css file, and this is like high level app stuff like CSS resets, etc. that I put in at the high level of the project. It's super lightweight, super tiny. That's really it. And then that could even be cleaned up, but it's just, you know, adding base fonts and base font sizes, etc. Then you have a couple JS chunks. You see it's there's 33K and 18.8K, so total you're still talking like right around 50K, 51K. And that's it. And then a couple like, you know, tiny little icons, etc., the manifest JSON, etc. So like this will load very, very fast. The total transfer is 60.9K, not including images if you're on someone's gallery site. That's huge compared to something like Instagram. I know that there's some discoverability on Instagram, so like there's a bunch of images, etc. But if we were just to inspect this, hit network, we're 5.8 megs transferred just for this site, just for this page. If we were to do the same thing on Slick, let's go to actually one of my like, so here's an attractive page. It even has some images. 1.3 megs transferred, and that's actually because not only are you looking at this page, but the next and previous were loaded as well behind the scenes to make that seamless. So even with that sort of behind the scenes kind of like performance tuning and efficiency at the cost of download, it's still a fraction of the size of Instagram. Secondly, I think to Matthew's point about, I think it was Matthew about Lighthouse or Yasira's. Let's run Lighthouse. So, what am I doing here? That's not it. Right, so let's run a Lighthouse report on Instagram. It's built into Chrome tools. Just go to inspect and then scroll over to the Lighthouse and hit generate report. Cool demo. I've never seen Lighthouse hang like this. Well, let's do it on Slick. Just in case. Lighthouse. Okay, let's close the other one. Here we go. Okay, so high on performance scale, high on best practices in SEO, low on accessibility, and then of course it'll give you the things to optimize. This is classic with me, is background and foreground colors do not have sufficient contrast ratio, and links do not have a discernible name because I'm using JavaScript injected links. And then the background foreground colors, because I like, you know, things like this, right? That link right there is failing that contrast ratio check. It's not accessible. It's not very like vision impaired friendly. And I oftentimes break those rules for the sake of attractiveness. Yeah, and that's it. And so you'd get your lighthouse score, and if we could ever get lighthouse to load up on this one,
That's
there we
pretty
go.
cool.
So the
Scores.
It was like 100 across the board a couple weeks ago, so I must have done something to really jack things up. There we go. So there's Instagram, right? 48 on performance. You know, it's just across the board, like much lower. And most sites are not as high as this because they make sacrifices, right? For the sake of, you know, ease of getting things published, or just for the sake of they got legacy code that they just sort of keep chugging along and optimizing a lighthouse score that users will never see. They'll just feel it. Does not become priority. But I would say these are worth chasing, especially performance, because this includes things like first meaningful paint, which is like when you can, and then also time to interact. That's huge. Like, when can you start using the page? There have been plenty of studies that show for every like 1/10 of a second, like you drop a pretty large percentage of users. Like, they're just like, it just feels slow. I'll just move on. We'll go somewhere else.
For sure, like for your landing page, especially, right? If you have a landing page, or if you have I don't know what you call it, but that, you know, for the demo of your product or stuff, if it's not good performance, then like if I have to wait for 2 seconds for it or to load, then I'll go somewhere else.
Yeah. And I think even to our discussion earlier about like state, this is like a lot of, I think, new developers will just get caught in the, all right, well, it's a slow API call my backend team or whatever gave me, or an external API call. So I'll just put a loading indicator and I'm good. So every single fetch will just trigger a loading indicator, and so you hit update on a thing or save, right? And the screen just locks up with a loading updater. And in about a second it comes back and you're like, okay, cool, I can do the next action. Well, that's a really terrible experience for a user. So that's where we use things like optimistic fetches, where we say, okay, look, I'm going to manage some of the state internally using, like, say, React query. I'm going to manage the state internally, and I'm going to fire that behind the scenes. But I'm going to operate from my app perspective as if it just worked, right? So you'll merge it internally in the internal state. You'll be running that fetch behind the scenes, and if you need to roll back because it gets a 400 or 500 or whatever, then you roll back the change, but you're going to assume that it works, which means user gets instant feedback. It's like, sweet, that was just really fast. Behind the scenes, those things are firing, but the user doesn't care. I think that's a much better experience. It gives a snappy feel. It's what we're used to, because, like, if every single time, let's say you were in your iPhone settings menu, and every single time you hit a toggle switch, let's say it was really communicating back with the server, and like every single time you hit a toggle switch, it's like screen locks up, loading indicator, and then screen unlocks, toggle switch has moved. You'd be like, oh, this is the clunkiest, most awful experience ever. But you can always just hide that stuff.
Yeah, I agree to the optimistic rendering pattern, because it's like, you still can go back and say like, oops,
Right.
when things goes wrong. But if your app is a good app and you assume that the internet is not cut off or something, it has to be successful, right? Unless, well, the
Right.
chance for it to be successful than error, it's really like big on the success. So then why not just like assume that it is success, handle it, and later on, if it's failed, then
I think most
Super
people
fun.
will err on the side of the loading indicator because it's an easier and more commonly documented pattern. It's like, well, I've got a loading state that I can figure out, right? So, like kind of what we discussed earlier. So here's just a loading component while that loading state is true. Like, that's a lot easier than saying, okay, let's create some rollback logic. And then also let's manage that state internally, versus just, well, I just do this and then I spit out whatever JSON it gives me back. That's what most people do. It's like they don't transform, they don't manage that state internally. It's just run my fetch, maybe transform the JSON, and then spit it out raw. Like, so it's a little bit more complicated doing the optimistic fetching.
Yeah, it is.
But yeah, it's I
But
think
it's
way better.
One question for the bundle size, is it affecting only the initial rendering, or is it when you say your bundle size is big, is it gonna affect once it's done also?
I mean, I would say by and large, the initial. You know, Chrome is relatively good at handling even like absurdly large JS bundle sizes. I would say if you can make your code shorter, it probably will run faster, because by the nature of shorter code, you're going to have like less branching and less just sort of overhead while it like, you know, and that's not always the case, of course. Like there are absolutely like large code that's much faster and more performance tuned than small code sometimes, depending on what you're doing in that code. But like, you know, if I had the option between like running a 200 line file or component versus like, you know, several 100,000 lines, I'm going to assume that that 200 line is faster by the nature of it just being smaller and just less crap going on.
Unless you can write a 200 by shrinking 1,000 down to 200, that requires a lot of coding skills.
Right.
I want to do 200, it's just I can't. Sometimes that's why you write a bunch of code.
Yeah, next time we'll talk about like code splitting.
Yeah, code splitting would be a good one to top to go on. And also like
another one also wanna, yeah, Kevin, I noticed you have very good sense of design, everything. I wanna learn something that also related to the designing.
Like we're doing like a styled component sort of exercise,
no,
or do you mean
when you create a when you create a button, depends on the location, what's the size, where you put it, also all the layouts.
Sure.
Something like related to the styling the app.
Yeah, so Yasira, for a little bit of background, in our app for work, we're slowly in the process of removing Material UI, and going to
styled. Yes.
And going to styled components, and it's I know I resisted styled components in the beginning. Like I literally was like, okay, like this doesn't buy me anything. I just keep using my SCSS. Like as long as you have a good build path, like Fusebox or Webpack or whatever else, just put on sidecar files of SCSS. Until I started understanding the power of dynamic props, and like it's just so nice having the CSS literally looking exactly like CSS, like not in sort of JS object form, but right there in my JSX component file. Like it's fantastic. So anyway,
sure, you guys using Material UI, right?
Yeah, we're still using Material UI.
But trying to convert it to completely style components.
Sorry, what is it?
You guys trying to convert it to style component like Marathon?
Not really.
So, right?
We have too many components right now, and like.
And so the deal with that, Matthew, like it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, and the simpler your app is, the more you can get away with not using one of these heavy design frameworks. Straight up,
right.
Like Slick, for instance. Like, what on earth would I have to gain from using one of them? Like, it's a huge download. Like, it's just really heavy both to work with in terms of bundler as well as just like the output. For like, I have nothing that's not custom written on it. It's like it's not specifically custom written. Something like the admin that you're working on this morning, for instance, like it starts to get diminishing returns of like building your own from scratch, because you are missing out on a lot of like carefully themed and cohesive elements that look and play nicely together, like form controls and select boxes and navigation. Yeah, it all looks like Material UI and like every other Material UI site, but at least it's cohesive. And that's where like honestly, my ideal would be a component library that did not require a global theme engine around anything. And I want it all extendable via styled components, so I can take your component, let's say from AntD or Semantic UI or whatever else, and I want to be able to just wrap it in a styled component block and take over some of those styles. Like I love components that are pre-done for me that have a great prop signature. Like that's my favorite. I'm just like, sweet, you have every on whatever event I could ask for. You have like the perfect change handlers. Like you've given me all the props, so I don't have to write all that crap myself. But your styles look like crap, and I just want to like, slightly enhance them or make them fit with my theme, but I don't want to have to use your theme engine or anything like that. So some component libraries do a much better job at this than others. And if anyone has a suggestion, like on component libraries that are not as opinionated in the style or in theming, please let me know, because I do know Material UI is a nightmare to try to retheme and restyle, unless you're an expert on styling and theming Material UI. So like, but like that's not the correct answer to me. It's like, oh, you just have to be an expert in this one really specific ecosystem to play in it at all. Like that's like, no, you should be able to be a rockstar styler / JavaScripter and modify anything in the JS ecosystem, in my opinion.
Yeah, because like now, like when I'm using Material UI, like because okay, I can just like style it in line with like whatever their props are, right? Like these buttons should be small and these buttons should be like what the size is. But then I ended up, with a different size of buttons on my app because I don't remember what styling do I use for my other buttons, and then I have to create the buttons. Yep. This is the one that I'm going to use for my app. So yeah, this kind of thing. Just need to restructure more probably.
I mean, I think it'd probably be worth like a little like sort of episode where we kind of do talk about like custom component building for like lower building blocks, because there are like a lot of little nuances that have to think about, because what most of us will do is like we need a button for one component, so we'll make a button and we'll go into another component and you'll be like, oh, but that component was really specific for that one form, I can't just like reuse it, so you make a second button and then a third button, and then at some point you're like, oh wait, I need one button class, and so you try to get that one button class with all the props to handle all the other 3 use cases, and now you have a really messy button that you're like, why do I have all these props that are like specific to the sidebar and to the top nav and to everything else? Like that button should be unaware of all that crap. So.
And you have buttons that has that need confirmation on the action.
Right. Or tooltips and all sorts of other stuff. Yeah. That's true. And honestly, having done some of that for Slick, like the select box that takes over the screen, and then like my own tooltips, like again, no design framework whatsoever. I think honestly some of these are really important lessons to know, even if you never do them again. Like to know how you could do these things is powerful. Even if it's just to say, cool, I know how to use it, that's why I will use someone else's library. Like for instance, routing. Like the first time you write a router that writes the regex to then parse to the route, you're gonna be like, you know what? I really appreciate path to regex library and the internals of Express, for instance, or KOA or whatever. So you would say, I will never write my own router again. I'll just use itty router as the internal. So anyway, yeah. So let's.
Yep.
Well, maybe we'll actually post an agenda next week.
Yep. I need to hop off.
Yep.
I have another meeting, one-on-one, after this. But
cool.
Yeah, let's do this again.
Yep, for sure.
Next week.
Next week.
Hope Mehdi can join us.
11 o'clock, 12 Central Standard, Tech Power Hour. Yeah, hopefully Mehdi can come back next week. And then your guest speaker.
Yeah, I don't know where he is. But yeah, I'll get in contact with him again. Okay then.
Cool. Later, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Bye.